Ahoy there, mates. Welcome aboard the VHS pirate ship and welcome to REEK of the Week, the little show here on the VHS pirate ship where I take a break from talking about VHS and movies and stuff and talk about 80s and 90s nostalgia. Yes, it's a segment that has the sweet stench of childhood memories and is the show you can smell. It's REEK of the Week. So it's spooky season once again, and spooky season means spooky stuff. And as a kid, there was no shortage of spooky stuff. It was seemingly everywhere you looked. And the spooky milieu was certainly concentrated in the world of toys. And today, we're going to cover such a topic and talk about those toys that were horror-based. Now, I'm only going to talk about some of them, certainly not all. That would take way too much time. Yeah, as you can imagine, there are lots of examples, which is odd because horror as a theme isn't really something that's focused on kids. Kids aren't supposed to watch horror, but they did, and toy manufacturers knew this damn well. And if you think about it, horror has always been sort of mildly geared towards kids as a market. Ever so subtle, but it was always there. All the horror comics and pulp magazines, and think about all the cartoons we watched as kids that had monsters in them. Yeah, of course there was Scooby-Doo. I mean, none of those monsters were real, but there were still horror elements to it. And we all watched Casper the Friendly Ghost. Come on, that's about a dead kid. Beetlejuice had its own cartoon. Then, of course, there was the real Ghostbusters, which dealt with ghosts and monsters and black magic and the occult on a regular basis. Then there was Filmation's Ghostbusters, which did the same thing, except there was a gorilla. And think of all the Looney Tunes cartoons that included monsters and or horror tropes. And it wasn't just animated stuff. The Three Stooges went up against mad scientists or monsters or both pretty much all the time. Then, of course, there were sitcoms like The Munsters and The Addams Family, which were all about monsters and horror stuff. And even something as innocent as Sesame Street had a vampire as one of the main characters, and half of the cast were freaking monsters. That's just a few examples. Horror tropes were everywhere when we were kids. The marketing of horror elements has always been hiding in plain sight, and this fact has most certainly always been prevalent in the toy market. Now, this topic is rather broad, so let's start with something sort of simple. And let's talk about toys that most of us more than likely had. Toys that were based on monsters. Not just any monsters, the monsters. The Universal Pictures monsters. Yes, Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, and the Wolfman all got action figures by the famous toy company Imperial. This toy company was huge. Even if you didn't know them by name, and you more than likely didn't, you certainly knew their game. Founded in 1969, this toy company would go on to be a major player in the toy market and a huge contributor to everybody's toy boxes. Everybody had at least something of theirs because they were so accessible. They were cheap and basically available everywhere. And the stuff that they made was just straight up neat. Besides the Universal monsters, they would also just make, any kind of monster. Like two-headed dragons and prehistoric hell beasts that almost looked Lovecraftian. And I'm guessing that pretty much all of us had at least one of these things in our lifetime. Imperial toys were just freaking neat. And other than the Universal monsters, they would also do some other licensed properties. They did a little toy for King Kong. And of course, they did the famous Godzilla figures. I mean, come on, who didn't have one of these? But they also did a little bendy figure of one of the aliens from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And back to the horror-themed toys theme, they also did an array of Jaws merchandise. Now, Jaws, as a property, would also have other merchandise without the help of Imperial toys. Like the Jaws board game from Ideal Toys, and this fantastic lifelike action figure from Chem Toys, which is, well, there it is. Yeah, this is one of those cheap rubber squeaky shark toys that you would find anywhere, and it just has a Jaws sticker on it, though it is debatable which one came first. Well, anyways, back to the Universal monsters, and incidentally enough, Jaws is technically a Universal monster as well. It's just not associated with the classic Universal monsters, even though I guess technically now it is because it's old and sort of the same era comparably, relatively to that time frame. I'll just forget it. It's always sort of bothered me as to why Imperial never made a Creature from the Black Lagoon figure. I mean, that was one of the classic Universal monsters, and they could have made one for the Bride of Frankenstein and the Invisible Man. Well, maybe they did, and we just couldn't see him. You know what I'm saying? Hey. Well, the creature from the Black Lagoon would be a concept that wasn't lost on every toy company, and Imperial Toys would not be the only toy company to tackle the Universal monsters. Yes, Remco would be all over the Universal monsters, and in 1980 they released their own toy line of said monsters, including the aforementioned creature from the Black Lagoon. And they also included the Phantom of the Opera in this toy line, which basically was the first Universal monster. Remco went all in on this one. Not only did they have the 3 3/4 inch action figures, which, by the way, would go right along with your Star Wars action figures. They were roughly the same size, so if you had these, there was no limit to what you could do. You could do Dracula versus Darth Vader, or Greedo versus Frankenstein's monster, and who could forget that classic matchup of the Phantom of the Opera versus the Besman security guard. So anyways, back to my original points, Remco also did a line of 9-inch Universal monsters with real clothes. And they also did another line of 3 3/4 inch action figures, but this time they glowed in the dark. Remco had play sets for this stuff and a Dracula hand puppet. I mean, Remco was all about Universal monsters. Speaking of that, how awesome is this Dracula hand puppet, by the way? Just look at it. It's tremendous. So not only would the Universal monsters have multiple toy lines, they would also ooze onto other toy lines. Namely, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles by Playmates, which of course was a huge toy line, both in expanse and popularity. Adding to that hugeness, in 1993, Playmates would release the Universal Monsters versions. Yes, it was a line of figures that featured the characters as Universal monsters. And of course, these sold extremely well, proving that you cannot go wrong with the Universal monsters, especially when you pair them up with the Ninja Turtles. In the world of toys, as well as basically everywhere else, the Universal monsters were a huge hit. But that is in no means where the horror-themed toy world ends. But this is where the episode does end, because it's just a huge realm to talk about, and I certainly cannot do it in one episode. So stay tuned for the REEK of the Week Horror-Themed Toys Part 2. So be sure to hit subscribe, keep it locked right here, and take care out there, and I'll see you next time! Only on Captain Adam's VHS Pirate Ship.
Enjoy these other classic REEK of the Week episodes, and be sure to hit subscribe.